Good afternoon. I'm very happy to see you all here. It's a topic that might sound at first like a bit of an abstract topic for a policy audience, as many of you are. But we believe it's a highly political issue. It's a topic really about the governance of the transition in Europe. It's a topic that can have really deep implications about how we manage energy policy in Europe, about also the role of European energy policy making, about the role of the state versus the private sector. So this is not an innocent, purely technical issue. It is a profoundly political one. And the reason why that is that that's a policy area, energy, that is kind of entrenched between the state and market forces. So you have and you need to have strong policy interventions, and policy interventions need data to be good, and you have strong market forces that either produce data and can share them or not share them. Energy, as those people that are interested in it, and I presume you are, is a super complex area. So it is highly technical area with a lot of acronyms, too many units that you know, and our American friends can tell us more about even more complex units. And the trade-offs in many energy policy questions are often not initially clear. So we have really we lack understanding. We want to know, and we need analysis to get there. So it's not that policymakers all of a sudden can decide CFDs are a good idea and we are introducing them. We need analysis to understand if not CFDs are a good idea. And identifying good solutions is technically not easy. But it's also politically not easy, because all the energy policy decisions that we take have not only implications for whether we find an optimal solution, which is hard to determine, but they also have massive distributional effects. Massive distributional effects between member states, massive distributional effects between different consumer groups, between producers, and between all of them at the same time. So it's not an innocent area where academics can come up with optimal solutions, and when they found them, they are implemented. But it's essentially a highly contested area where everybody wants to push for their solution, even if it's not the optimal solution, but it's good for them. And there is always a high risk to essentially mix the technical analysis with the distributional analysis, and I mean that is happening a lot. And I believe that having a profound infrastructure of data and potentially of modeling that is transparent, that allows to have good technical discussions, needs to be at the foundation of good policy making, because we need to understand what the distributional outcomes are. We need to understand what optimal solutions are. And therefore, energy information is not a technical question, as I initially said. It is fundamentally about governance and the status quo that we currently have, and Ben will explain a bit from the paper that Simone, Ben, and I did. The status quo, in our view, is not really ideal. So we need in Europe to massively move ahead. The energy crisis showed a lot that we lacked granular enough data, that we lacked timely enough data, that we lacked certain types of data. We understand that member states start to take the issue in their own hands. So there are initiatives in individual member states to move ahead with better data provision, which is great. But then the question is, how do we pool that with a European policy making? The International Energy Agency has done a great job during the energy crisis. They were often able to do stuff much faster, much better. The European Commission draw heavily on them. Now, the International Energy Agency is not a European body per se. It has stakeholders across the world, and sometimes they have different interests. So we need to see how that is calibrated. And with the transition ahead, we have a rapidly developing policy field. So it's really an area where where we need not only the data from yesterday, but we actually need the data from tomorrow. With all that, I would like to motivate you to see that as a non-technical but highly political issue. And I'm super happy to have a great panel here to discuss that with you. And I would like to first introduce and give the floor to Ben McWilliams. He has been a long-standing Bruegel colleague, started as a research analyst and or assistant, and even as an intern. So has been with us for a while. He has an economics background, and he is responsible for many of the great Bruegel data products that you can find online that we developed over time. So on gas demand, on gas imports, now on clean tech and other things. And he has been one of the co-authors on our piece on the energy information problem. So Ben, the floor is yours. Take like 10, 15 minutes to introduce very concisely the paper.
Sure, thanks, Georg. I have a couple of slides which have come online. As Georg mentions, I will give a brief overview of this piece together with Georg and Simona Tagliapietra, who I think is not with us today, in the next 10 minutes. So the motivation of what we are discussing today, which I don't think is controversial, I think the controversy is going to come at the end of this presentation when we discuss sort of the hows and to go about building such better data. The motivation is that in the EU and in energy policy, the EU is still faced by this trilemma, these three competing objectives. We want to achieve decarbonization, which implies reallocating significant amounts of GDP. Competitiveness concerns have perhaps risen back up the agenda, and the EU wants to be competitive in a range of industries and compete with China, compete with the US, compete globally. And finally, security of energy supply, which was dramatically exposed in 2022 with the cut in Russian gas flows and the lack of data that was available there. And our argument, which I think many would share, is that the EU suffers from the under-provision of data and information in each of these areas. And when policymakers are formulating policies, when companies are going about their strategies, there is a lack of open and transparent data and information with which to do this. Now, in the piece, we try to categorize this problem first in an abstract sense by the type of information gap. And in the next slide, I'll have a few more examples on specifics. So we put forward six areas that we think are problematic and 6 areas to think about this. The first is primary data. So there is some data which simply is not collected. You could think of, for example, with the Net Zero Industry Act, I think the data is now starting to be collected, but the EU set itself the target to manufacture 40% solar panels, 40% electrolyzers, 40% wind turbines. But if you would ask, what's the level today compared to the demand? It was very hard to know. This Bloomberg New Energy Finance, if you pay a lot of money, you can find this. And the data has improved in the last couple of years, but it's still, I would say, somewhat lacking. You then have comparable issues, comparability, which is a function of the fact that the EU is a collection of 27 member states, and there are different levels of energy agencies in different countries who do different things. Sometimes they report different data or they don't report the same data, and occasionally when they report the same, what you would think would be the same piece of information, they follow slightly different methodologies, which is a second issue. Consistency. So sometimes data are reported even by different European agencies for what ostensibly would be the same variable, but because of different regulations and different reporting obligations, they arrive at slightly different numbers, which is quite confusing to look through. Accessibility is a big one, I think. It's great to have all of the data, but if you're an energy researcher and you want to have your model looking at the system, you first go to ENTSO-E and you figure out how the API works at ENTSO-E. You get your electricity data, great. Let me see how much gas was being consumed to compare it. Now you run another API, you go to ENTSO-G, you figure out how this API works. Maybe you want to complement it with something on oil, so you go to DG Ener or Eurostat. At the end of the day, you've lost a year and you haven't gotten to your research question. So the accessibility of information is a problem. There's an issue sometimes with non-partisan information, which is that certain information comes from organizations which the information potentially is likely of high quality, but an example would be the 10-year development plans for grids in Europe, which are put forward by ENTSO-E and ENTSO-G. So associations of the TSOs themselves, which raises questions. And a last one on transparency. So on transparency, I think a key example we would point to here would be European Commission modelling, which uses a model called Primes, which is owned by a UK consultancy and which is proprietary. So it's not open access. People cannot see. You get some things made available, but you cannot see exactly inside the workings of the model, and it makes it harder for third parties to come back to the Commission and challenge things like the climate 90% climate targets for 2040, 55% for 2030. So that was an abstract overview of the data problems that we see. A little bit on the status quo in Europe. I'm not going to say much. In the piece, we have a short section explaining the situation in the US, where there's an Energy Information Administration. This is a federal body which is responsible for collecting all of energy data and specifically making it available to the public in a comprehensible way. Joe is the former administrator, so I let him say more there. The situation in the EU is different. The situation in the EU, and this was formed in the 1970s, the EIA, so in response to the oil crisis, one agency made. The situation in the EU is a little different, where over time, over the last 30 years, an amalgamation of institutions has grown to report different pieces of data. And typically when new regulations are passed, new responsibility is given to an institution to collect a new piece of data, which in a sense is great. I mean, Europe does have good data. There are good data that exists, and these reporting obligations, something like the ENTSO-E transparency platform is great. You can access electricity data at hourly level. Part of the problem is that you end up with 6 or 7, ENTSO-E, ENTSO-G, Acer, JRC, DG Ener, and the list goes a little bit further on, who all report different data in different places, which causes challenges. We have in the piece, probably was the most controversial part, and people push back on it's subjective, right? Your assessment on different pieces of data, how good you think it is, how hard you think it is to use different platforms. So people can discuss on uranium, critical minerals, industrial production. Building stock, I think, is something which is very poorly tracked in the EU at the moment, understanding how many heat pumps are in different homes, who has gas turbines, who has oil-burning turbines, which is critical for reaching decarbonisation targets in buildings. How many heat pumps really need to be rolled out and deployed? The European Heat Pump Association makes a good effort to improve this situation, but there's no publicly available database on how many heat pumps do we really need in the EU in the next few years. So I hope I convince you of the problem. Then I come to what the EU should do to improve the situation. We put forward this simple triangle, which kind of is intended as a triangle where the bottom layer is the most important, and it builds upwards. The first is the comprehensive provision of energy information, which is what I've been talking about before. This is an anchor point and providing one platform, one area where you can go to and be sure that this is the accepted European official number for a particular variable, the imports of electricity from Germany to Denmark or other variables, that you go to this place, you download the data set, and you have your electricity data, your gas data, your oil data, everything made available. As a beginning point would be everything that already exists today. Over time, I think I mentioned that primary data is an issue. So over time, I think there would need to be new data collected and building upon this. But the first thing is there should be one anchor point where people can go and access data and kind of be an accepted reference point for discussion. A second layer, which probably Tom will expand more on, is raw data in itself is the essential ingredient and the essential building block, but typically for policy processes, you need to do some transformations, pretty complex transformations of this data and this information to arrive at deeper and more profound insights. And the biggest example for energy and energy systems is modeling. So how do you put all of this data on electricity flows, gas flows, oil flows, consumption demand into one system and try and test things like, should there be a new transmission line built between France and Spain? You know, how would that have impacted the blackout that happened last week? And to answer that question, it's not enough to have only the raw information. You need on top of this to have modeling frameworks for answering more complex questions. And so that would be a second layer, having a reference point for this, which is that there is a thriving modeling ecosystem in Europe. The Horizon framework under the Commission there's great work supporting this, but what is still lacked is kind of an open and accepted by everybody point, for example, used by all the institutions to kind of be, again, the anchor point, but now for modeling. And the last one, which clearly is important for such an agency, is how this is integrated into policy processes. In certain cases, you might want this to be somewhat automatic, so something like the gas filling targets that have been set in the EU, where if a country misses its gas filling target and you track the data, this has a somewhat automatic integration, and the Commission should be able to notify a member state. This is probably quite occasionally. Most of the time, this feeds informally into policy discourse by providing useful information and allowing parliamentarians, etc., to debate with such information. So my last and closing slides comes to what I mentioned at the beginning. I think will be the most controversial. I think the idea that we need better information and better data to make better decisions, I think is widely accepted, but the question is, how do you go about doing this? A first fundamental question is the degree to which this is done at the national or the European level. In America, with the United States system, I think it's a little bit easier for this to be done at the federal level as it is. In Europe, if, as an economist, the most efficient solution would be that an entity based, doesn't have to be in Brussels, in Slovenia or somewhere else, has the authority to, for example, send surveys to industries around Europe and collect additional data. Politically, that's going to be controversial, and Eurostat and the European Environment Agency have shown that the preferences of the Council in the past were more for a kind of hub and spoke model, where you have a central agency who then interacts with national statistical bodies and pulls that all back into one place. Second big question is the case put forward compelling that there needs to be a new agency for delivering on this, or is it feasible to do this by expanding existing institutions? Expanding existing institutions is, of course, politically easier, and you can imagine this can happen more quickly. There are issues. Can particular institutions take on a mandate this large and not be encumbered by sort of legacy issues or legacy way they've been set up over the previous years? And if it is expanding existing institutions, who does what? We then have a big question, which is on the mandate about what information should be collected, where, again, Joe might expand, but something I think very interesting about the EIA in America is the administrator there has the authority to go out and collect new data. He or she must pass through a process in the White House, and it must be checked that this makes sense, it's not crazy, and it doesn't add an excessive administrative burden on industry, but the mandate to go and look for new data comes from within the organization who best knows the data, which you might create some issues of capture and the fact this agency has so much power. On the other hand, it avoids the process in Europe where it needs to go around a few different bodies to kick off. The type of information that should be collected, different types, Eurostat, which has very high quality data and takes 2 years to arrive at certain data, which has trade-offs and is good in the end, the data they arrive at, versus other institutions who try to collect quicker and you might say more dirty data. And how do you find the correct balance between wanting to arrive at the perfect data eventually, but for example, in something like an energy crisis, when you need some quick data, accepting that the data might be 95% perfect, but you publish it 1 year earlier, and how do you kind of balance this? And the last one is the involvement of non-EU countries, people like the UK, Ukraine, Norway, who are not in the EU, but clearly are highly relevant for the European energy system. So that's the conclusion of our paper. We kind of left it open with these questions, and the ambition of the paper, and I hope to listen now to Georg and the panelists, is to kick off this discussion in Brussels and try to push forward. Thanks.
I think I switched myself. Sorry. Thanks a lot, Ben. I think it was very clear what we did in the paper. The paper, as you can see itself, is more comprehensive on the details. But I think that it was very useful to have this more high level overview now. I would now like to give the floor to Joe De Carolis. He has a wide academic background in engineering and public policy and environmental science and physics. He is currently transitioning to a job at Carnegie Mellon, and he has been long-standing also academic energy modeler. Also has worked for several years in the Environmental Protection Agency of the US. But the reason why we invited Joe, and I'm super happy that he made himself available to come over here, is that he led the Energy Information Administration for the year since 2021 under the Biden administration. And that in this function, he has seen an institution that in certain aspects could serve as an example of what is potentially feasible also on the European side. So I can all encourage you to have a look on the website of the Energy Information Administration. It's really a fantastic website that I personally like a lot, because they manage to get the balance right between presenting data in a form that is kind of visually appealing, but at the same time you are able to get to the data that you need to download to do your own analysis, and that all in one place. But that's certainly not all that you did there, and would be very happy to have your reflections a bit on this discussion in Brussels that you have now observed.
Great. Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be here. I thought I'd give just a very brief overview of EIA. The first thing I want to make clear is that I am the former EIA administrator. So in the United States, the administrator is a political appointee. So I was appointed by President Biden, and I left office in January when he did. So I'm speaking from my personal experience as a former administrator in that role. I'm now a professor currently at NC State and will be transitioning soon to Carnegie Mellon. So the Energy Information Administration is the official statistical agency within the Department of Energy. There are actually 13 official statistical agencies across the U.S. federal government. So you might have heard of the Census Bureau or Bureau of Labor Statistics. Again, EIA is the statistical agency responsible for energy data. And one of the things about being a statistical agency that's important is that Congress has vested unique authority in EIA to collect energy data from industry. So EIA has the authority to go to industry and provide a mandatory survey that they need to respond to. So we are able to collect data in that way. We do have a comprehensive survey program. There's dozens of surveys that are out there in the field every day. On the supply side, we have surveys that capture essentially the whole supply chain for natural gas, petroleum, electricity, coal, uranium, biofuels. So there's a comprehensive survey program in place. And on the consumption side, we also have 3 large consumption surveys. There's one that covers the residential sector, another that covers commercial buildings, and then a third one that covers manufacturing. So a big part of the work that EIA does is to collect this primary data and then make it publicly available. There's another part to EIA that's more analytical and does both short and long-term modeling. So there's a short-term energy outlook that gets produced on a monthly basis. It's an econometric model. And then they also do long-term projections in the United States. It's called the Annual Energy Outlook. And then there's also a global version with a different model called the International Energy Outlook. And there we strive to be as transparent as possible. So you can find the input data. The output tables are available to a high high degree of sort of granular data that you can access. And while I was administrator, we also started to make some of our models open source. So for example, the National Energy Modeling System, which we use to produce the Annual Energy Outlook, is now open source and available on GitHub. And I think that transparency is really important. EIA is doing the very best it can to model the world as they see it. And I think it's very important to build trust among stakeholders for that modeling work to be as transparent as possible. So taken collectively, I would say that if you pick up a newspaper or an article and it cites some kind of energy statistic about the United States, there's a very good chance that the primary reference is to the Energy Information Administration. And I think all of that data really serves as the foundation on which our understanding of the US energy system is built. And then just the very final point that I want to make, and this is extremely important to EIA's mission, is that EIA is independent and impartial. So we do need to seek permission before we put a new survey in the field. That has to be approved by the Office of Management and Budget. But when we process data and we release it, or we want to release a report, the 1977 enabling legislation literally says that the administrator does not need to seek the permission of any other member of the federal government before releasing that data. And that's really where EIA's independence comes from, is that I keep saying we, they do the very best they can to analyze an issue, and then they make it available without worrying about the political implications or seeking permission from folks that hold a political office. And that ability to be independent, to make independent decisions about the release of data and information, is extremely important to EIA's mission. With that, I'll turn it back.
Many thanks, Joe. I think and it provided a kind of a very, very kind of crisp view on kind of how the EIA functions, and I think we in the Q&A can kind of come back to some of the points and push you a bit further on that. But you mentioned open modeling, and that's also perfect transition to Tom Brown. Tom Brown has a background in mathematics and physics. He is currently professor at the Technical University in Berlin, and he's essentially one of the champions in Europe on open energy modeling with the PIPESA model that is by now widely used also by institutions in Europe. And yeah, it would be very interesting to have your reflections on kind of to which degree we have a data problem, and also to which degree maybe open modeling approaches can help us here.
Yes, thank you very much, Georg. So I'm an energy system modeler, and I would probably provide a perspective from a user's perspective on the data and as a supplier's perspective on the modeling, because we lead the development of Python for power system analysis, PIPESA, which is a tool which is used worldwide, an open source tool for analyses of energy systems, looking granularly how to integrate renewables, for example, what the impacts on infrastructure and flexibility are of doing that. And as well as that sort of code side, we also maintain the data for a European model, PIPESA Europe, where we use all of this data. And as a data user, we see the daily frictions of not having this kind of institution. So we're pulling into the model data from Eurostat, data from the JRC, data from the EEA, all these different sources, and constantly having to deal with these frictions of backfilling for missing countries, for Switzerland, for the UK. There are missing data that we have to backfill. We have some data on the gas pipelines, but in some areas there's no data on the capacities, so we have to make assumptions the whole time. And this effort that we have to do to clean all the data is being duplicated all over Europe by dozens and dozens of modeling institutions. So just from a pure efficiency argument, having a central place to collect this data, clean it, validate it, judge its quality would already be a very big win. See, open data is a public good. Nobody has a particular incentive to provide it, but it has a very, very high public benefit being available. It doesn't diminish with use. It's a perfect example of a public good, and that would be the argument then to make this available. So as a data user, I was very welcome to see the report. So another aspect I think is important to stress is the timeliness. Why now? Why is this important right now? And I can see a couple of reasons. We have already quite good availability of data that was highlighted in the report in some areas. For example, for the electricity system, from the transparency platform, we have databases like the JRC, the ideas database. So there's already elements of this there that need to be pulled together, and there's enough of them that it'd be very useful to have coordination, to have this comparability and accessibility, and have that coordinated. That's on the data side. And on the modeling side, we're actually seeing the open source tools really being used and gaining credibility. So I've been pushing on this topic for 10 years already, and 5 years ago there was not this maturity on the data or the modeling side. But now we actually see open source models like pipes are being used at the institutional level, by the IEA, by ASA for their flexibility needs study, being helped by a company, Open Energy Transition. We're seeing the JRC use the tools for their assessment on redispatch and congestion management. And there's also a project also running to help run the T1DP process, the scenario modeling and the CBA, also in parallel with open source tools. So we're seeing actually that institutional buy-in for the tools, which means that when you start such an agency, you're not really starting from scratch. There's the elements there already to make this work. It just needs to all be pulled together. So I think now is the good time, the right time to push for this. And as well as all the arguments that Joe was making for trust and transparency, having that availability, it increases trust, of course, by people being able to duplicate the studies. That raises the reproducibility question. Having that all there is also very good, but you also have to think of the innovation that this unleashes. It enables many more actors to do these kind of analyses. So we've seen the open tools being taken up by Georg's team to analyze the Ukraine, how they managed the winter crisis. We've seen civil society use the tools for their own analyses with the Paris Agreement compatible scenarios, as well as these institutional users like TSOs, ASA, and NSOE. And what we constantly see is companies with new business ideas. Maybe they want to do a new thermal energy storage concept for process heat, or they come with an idea for enabling vehicle to grid or something, and they need models to test them. And having this available allows them to test new ideas and innovate in a way that isn't possible without this infrastructure. So we're already seeing some of this benefits in the open tools that you enable new actors to come in, and given the large number of challenges that we're currently facing for competitiveness, for decarbonization, for security of supply, we need everyone and everybody collaborating on these tools, because no single institution has that knowledge there. And by opening up the tools, you also open up the space for contributions from a wide selection of people, because it's very interconnected, the energy system. We understand that now, and having different contributions from different sides, this collaboration that's enabled by open source is also a very powerful tool for addressing our problems. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Tom. And I think it kind of reaffirmed a bit what I also would want to take from Joe, is that somewhat tested approaches to public data provision and use are becoming increasingly available. So it's not that we kind of come up with a pie in the sky idea if one calls for a more open, transparent European sort of approach to energy data and modeling, but that there is a development. Might kind of plaidoyer from our paper would be that some institutional form for that will, however, be needed, that this is not something that develops out of its own, but that there, in order to make it a reference point for the debate, there needs to be some institutional buy-in. But there's one question on that I find challenging, and in discussions with policymakers was confronted with, which is to which degree is there a risk of essentially monopolizing the debate with the data and modeling, then being kind of having just one reference point that is there? Is there not a risk that kind of your successor likes technology B, and therefore that's the result that comes out of the agency, and it makes it very very politically difficult to then have a different discussion than that?
I actually I actually think that having a consistent reference point is really beneficial. So if you talk to 10 energy experts and ask them what they think about the annual energy outlook projections, for example, you'll get 10 different opinions and probably 10 reasons why the projections are wrong. But I think the key point is that those projections serve as a critical benchmark. So people can be unhappy, they might not believe it, but it's a really useful jumping off point. So it's not that the work, for example, the modeling work that EIA does essentially becomes the narrative, but it becomes the reference point that then allows other modeling teams or other analysts to then explore alternative scenarios.
Another question that I would have is on commercial data. We had during the crisis very often the challenge that the data is sometimes only available as commercial data, and some of those things are highly relevant for policymakers. How to bridge that gap? Is there a risk to also crowd out then commercial providers and maybe have less innovation on that side, or is that is it possible to organize some sort of good collaboration?
Yeah, I think that the commercial data is a nice complement to the publicly available data. So, when EIA collects data, they only have the authority to do that within the boundaries of the United States. But the agency also tracks what's happening internationally, and for that they do rely on other data sources, including commercial data sets. So I do think that the commercial data sets are important, that you can't collect all of the primary data that you would need in order to put together a complete picture of the global energy system. So I think commercial data is always going to be there. And there have been instances at EIA where there's domestically collected energy data, and EIA will actually work with the vendor to negotiate making some of that data publicly available, often not in the raw form, but it might be aggregated, it might be time lagged. But if there's a value to the public and there's the budget to do it, in some instances, we can actually make some of that commercial data available.
And can you maybe say a few more words on how the agency decided on what data to collect and how dynamic it is there, and maybe also something on the size and budget, if that is public information?
Sure. So as far as the surveys go, because EIA has been around since the late 70s, many of those surveys are long-standing. It was established following the energy crisis. So initially there was a lot of focus, for example, on petroleum and coal. But those surveys have evolved over time. So there's kind of a continuous process. Again, there's dozens and dozens of surveys in the field. Many of those surveys are updated over time. So it might be that some questions are removed, new questions are added. Some surveys are discontinued because they're no longer relevant. Some are added as new issues arise. And that really comes from EIA professionals looking and trying to figure out what's really needed. And then every time there's a change, whether it's to discontinue a survey, add a survey, or change something, it has to go through this process of approval through the Office of Management and Budget.
So, something that Ben mentioned on Europe was that we have this large amount of institutions that are collecting certain types of data, and is that in the US also partly the case, that there are some data that are collected by somebody else and kind of you're just also publishing it or republishing it and collecting and harmonizing that, or is it all essentially your original primary data?
Most of the vast majority of data that EIA publishes is primary data that the agency collects. There are instances where there is commercial data. So for example, on electric vehicle registrations, there's third-party commercial data that EIA has negotiated making available with aggregated to the national level and time lagged.
But it's not like that there is some kind of big data source from, I don't know, the census or so that that kind of then is also made available through EIA, that you kind of, in a sense, kind of harmonize in a way with the data that you have, so that it's kind of consistent as such. So that are just different institutions that are then doing it for their specific niche or area.
So as far as the commercial data providers, there's not, kind of a monolithic business that's collecting really large amounts of energy data. It seems more specific to, companies are specific to certain
I meant more
sectors.
like the other public
So within,
institutions. Yeah.
so that's the other piece, is that there are other, as I mentioned, there's a total of 13 federal statistical agencies. Much of it's not so much about republishing each other's data, but there is a lot of work to coordinate on methodology and approach in the surveys. We often ask similar kinds of questions in the surveys, and we want to make sure that across the federal statistical agencies that we're following, we're being consistent, and we're following the same procedures.
Just to get to the commercial data, I mean, there must be a threshold, for example, with the EVs, where you would maybe think we're paying commercial provider, and at some point we'll do our own survey as well. So you had that choice then to choose that boundary on a cost-benefit analysis or something.
Yeah, I mean, there's always, budget is no matter what is a scarce resource, and so if you were thinking, taking that as a particular consideration, you'd have to think, okay, you have these competing priorities. We might want to collect EV data, or or something else. There's probably 5 or 6 competing alternatives, maybe a new survey on data centers or something like that. So you have to look at those competing priorities, what seems to be the public need, the more immediate public need, and then also budget. These surveys can be expensive. It does require budget. There's a lot of research that goes into developing the statistical frame for a survey. You have to put the survey in the field. You have to have folks who are following up with the respondents who are not providing their answers. So there's a lot of work and effort and budget that goes into a survey. So it really is a judgment about what is the greatest public need, and how can we make this happen given current budget constraints.
Thank you. I would like to slowly move to kind of open the floor to you. There is for the online audience, but also if you like here in the room and don't want to ask a question personally, the possibility to do it on Slido, where the hashtag is energy information as one word. I see one question here in the room. Can get a microphone. And maybe you can briefly introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. Maybe 3 small questions. The first one is, how do you get politicians interested in this question, which traditionally is a difficult issue? I mean, they usually not interested about the quality of data or your modeling problems, etc. Second question is, to what extent is privacy? I mean, a lot of data you need now is about consumption and behind the meters data. Is privacy an obstacle, or EU law an obstacle in terms of gathering some data? And a third one, you're talking a lot about energy information problem for policymakers, but isn't there such similar problem for network manager and operators like NSUI? Do they have enough information to keep stability of the network, etc.? Thank you.
Do you want to kick off?
I think one way to interest the politicians is, of course, selling the benefit. So we brought up the crisis after the Russian escalation of the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. There was a lot of modeling efforts directly after that, and they were really hindered by the lack of data. So people were taking our models to work out what kind of LNG would need to be imported, or what kind of volumes, and what the benefits of installing more renewables and electrification would be in reducing gas demand, and it was really slowed down and hindered by the lack of data. So this ability to respond quickly to crises is definitely one benefit, and then there's a transparency for the long-term planning as well. So I think there's a very clear use cases that would be interesting, of course, to politicians there. I think you had a follow-up. Well, I think that the crisis there shows that we didn't think ahead. I mean, just to emphasize that this data collection needs to be going on continuously, and it's not just informing crisis reaction, it's informing policy the whole time. It's informing, as you were saying, the network operators need this data for their grid planning, and many companies, when they're formulating their business strategies, are also needing that data too. So,
I mean, one classic example would be the Energy Information Administration, right? I mean, it was created after the oil crisis in the US, and a few years after. So we would be exactly at that stage now in Europe to have something to learn from. On the privacy side, is there?
Yeah, I mean, the raw data that EIA collects is often sensitive. There are privacy concerns. So the raw data is not made. It's protected by law, and it's not made publicly available. And what EIA does is they run statistical procedures on that raw data. It gets aggregated to a level where those privacy concerns are protected, and then that's the data that's released. But there's a lot of statistical methodology that goes into protecting the data to make sure that, for example, you're looking at a data set and you can't look at a data point and figure out, oh, that must be this company in this state. I could tell by that number. So there's a lot of thought that goes into the statistics that ultimately get published.
Yeah, and maybe Joe can speak in a second to the heterogeneous user groups for the IEA data, but this data is really needed by the TSOs, for example. They need to know about demand electrification, that's not their area of expertise, how building efficiency then impacts on heat pump demand, which impacts on electricity. They often have very poor sight on what's going on in the distribution grids. I've talked to TSOs, and they can't even exchange data within the TSO because of data restrictions. And opening up the data really leverages all of these different providers to help each other there. I think the case there is kind of strong, and we see users in TSOs. As I've mentioned civil society as well. There's a very broad number of people who profit from it. One of the nice things, Rufus Pollock, who ran the Open Knowledge Foundation, said the best thing that's ever done with your data will be done by somebody else. So there is a very wide users of data, and you don't know what kind of innovations people will be doing that. We've seen tons of new dashboards being put up to help ordinary citizens understand what's going on in the system, and that's been enabled by this open data. So dashboards to help people understand the gas crisis, to understand electricity prices. Those have all been enabled by having this data available. So it's also citizen focused. There are big benefits to having open data.
I guess the one other thing I'll say about the getting politicians interested. I mean, obviously, I was at EIA for roughly a little short of 3 years, and we would receive requests. So we already have a comprehensive program. And my observation was that politicians have a particular interest. So can you please collect data on this, or I need to know more about another issue. And when you, kind of to Tom's point, when you take a more holistic look at the collective interests of members of Congress, as an example, it is pretty comprehensive. It points to the need for comprehensive open data in order to make better decisions.
Maybe we can go to the first question here on the Slido from Will Usher from KTH. What policy measures are needed to promote the sharing, curation, and collection of European energy data? So, would you have any sense of policy actions that could unlock better curation and collection, and maybe also relate somewhat to Robbie's question on legal issues?
Yeah, so one thing is that where there are transparency mandates, as there are in certain areas for NSOE, for example, when writing the legislation, to really put clearly what we mean by reusable and open data. So actually specifying that it needs to have a very clear license. So licensing is very important. The license tells you what you can do with the data and specifies your rights basically as a user to reuse the data in a very clear manner. It's very important to have those licenses on the data, and specifying that is a very good idea, and having this coordination of what licenses to use. So the Commission has a recommendation for its data to use Creative Commons licenses with attribution, the CC BY license, and that's very helpful just to coordinate so that everybody is using the same license, and that's interoperability. So putting more mandates, clearer mandates for licensing of the data, maybe broadening the mandates to include other sets of data that aren't very well visible. So particularly on the demand side, we struggle, for example, with the building sector. That's what Ben was highlighting. But things like the number of heat pumps in a particular region, or the number of gas boilers rather, and what their ages are, is very, very important for understanding at what point you can start pushing heat pumps to replace those gas boilers, or understanding what the current age structure is of the steam crackers being used for plastics production in Europe, and what their age structure is, so you can then slot in a cleaner solution directly afterwards. There's a lot more data sets that need to be improved. Those were ones that Ben highlighted. Pushing for the licensing, coordinating, making sure that also we're collecting data on all the European countries and the neighbours, because we have a European model. We can't exclude Switzerland or the UK because they're bound into the grids. So those are maybe a few measures that would be adjustments to the current policy situation, but having the centralized agency would be the main one that I think you were pushing for in the article. This central agency that coordinates all of this, that has the independence to choose what's collected and to start pushing for a more common open modeling foundation. That would be the really big thing, which I think your article very, very nicely highlights and sets out the arguments for.
Maybe one more question, and slightly pushing back from your colleague Max Parzen from Open Energy Transition. He asks, if modeling is 100% open and transparent, would it be more efficient and secure? No, I switched here. And secure to outsource it to the market instead of running it at an agency. So a bit the question of kind of if you let 100 flowers bloom with that, can we not reach a better result?
Do you want to go first? So I guess a couple of thoughts there. I mean, one is having the open source model and input data is really important, but it's kind of like turning over the keys to a race car, right? Just because you have a Lamborghini doesn't mean that you know how to drive it, right? So I do think that there's real value in having a consistent team of model developers apply the model, again, as I was talking about at EIA, to serve as that benchmark. I mean, you might disagree with the approach. You might think there's a better way to do it. You might think there's better data, but there's value in having, a government agency produce a set of projections with total transparency. And then that then provides, I think, the jumping off point for other groups who want to do analysis. And I do think that there's a real opportunity there. If it is reproducible and others can apply easily, it will lead to more insights. It will lead to more innovation.
Yeah, I would completely agree. It really helps to have that institutional backing for credibility, to have a model that's been run past all the different institutions, it's had feedback from all the different industry associations, to have sort of battle-tested models that have been around for many, many years and have that credibility is really, really important. And something, it's a stage that we're just reaching with the open models, where models like primes, they've been through all these battles already, and they're understood, the weaknesses and the strengths, and they're kind of trusted then as a reference point, just like NEMS is in the US. And nobody's saying it's a perfect model, but the weaknesses and strengths are known, and that they've been through all these different debates and questioning processes.
There's a question. Please wait for the microphone because of the online audience.
Thank you. Okay. So I really
Can
like.
you briefly introduce yourself? Sorry.
Yeah, I'm Anglos Koutsis. I work for a Belgian environmental climate NGO called Bond Beter Leefmilieu, and we have worked a lot on gas issues. So I like that in your report you highlight the discrepancies between different sources about energy information, like if you get your energy from Eurostat or DJ in there, or you get it from a private market player like S&P Global or Bloomberg. And this highlights the need to have like a more centralized energy information administration or agency. But another big issue that we have encountered that some information is available for example, you have gas interconnections between France and Belgium. But if you go on ENTSO-G transparency platform, it's a virtual interconnection point. So the data is aggregated together, but you do not know how much is flowing through which pipeline, which is actually crucial. For example, the port of Dunkirk, it's next to Belgium, and there's a direct pipeline going there. And part of the energy crisis and part of thinking about security of supply, which energy information is needed for, is also knowing what is the origin of the gas we're importing. And currently we do have that for the import terminal, but once it's in the EU's internal gas grids, it can be whitewashed because gas that's coming from Dunkirk will be labeled French gas in Belgium. For example, Germany has banned the import of Russian LNG through the new terminals, but some of our work has shown that via Belgium and France, they are still importing Russian gas. So my question is more how do you guarantee, even if you have a centralized agency or administration, that they will also guarantee that the right information is being shown on that platform? Also regarding, for example, long-term contracts that are very hidden and are also very important regarding security of supply questions in the EU. Thank you.
I mean, I personally would expect that this is complex, also political discussions to be had on some of those things. I mean, there are also trade-offs between commercial sensitive issues. I mean, Ben can tell more about the challenges on the virtual gas points in Europe and how much time it took to get kind of a representation that we can work with. My understanding on the gas is also, but maybe Ben, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that there is no good publicly available data on LNG sources of origin. So probably one has to buy this data from Bloomberg or somebody else. So even so, that is, in my view, a politically highly relevant question and not a super complicated question. We do not have this data available. Still, we do policy measures on phasing out Russian LNG without kind of having our own proper database on that.
If I could just make a more general point on that. The U.S. process is far from perfect, but the way that it would work is, let's say EIA wanted to stand up a survey to collect that data. There's an announcement that goes into the Federal Register, and there's a 60-day period where anyone in the public can comment on the proposed data collection. So you might have a gas supplier say, whatever you do, don't provide the data by pipeline, there are security or whatever the issues are. And then you might have yourself saying, in order to do the work that I need to do, we really need this information. All of that feedback is collected. EIA staff would have to provide responses, and then it gets evaluated by the Office of Management and Budget. So again, it's not perfect. There's 2 rounds of that public comment period. The first is 60, then there's another 30-day comment period following the 60-day for any follow-ups, and then all of that gets evaluated to ultimately determine the characteristics of the survey.
It's very interesting that you have this engagement of stakeholders and also determine which data is or how the data.
There is one kind of follow-up question here on the on Slido, which is essentially on security sensitive data and how then potentially within how the discussions on such security sensitive data is being settled. So would it be the stakeholders? Would it be then the White House, or who is then saying that certain data are security sensitive, therefore it's not possible to collect or present them? Because it's an argument that is very often being used to prevent publication of data for good or bad reasons.
Yeah. I think that feedback could come from a number of sources. I mean, so it could be that, EIA analysts, statisticians decide, they might want data but realize that it's not even worth pursuing because there are these questions around security. It could be that through this public comment period, that point is made very strongly by key constituents, and so that would be factored in. So again, I think because of the process, if there are real security concerns around the collection or the form in which the data is made publicly available, that there's an opportunity to air those concerns and then evaluate them and ultimately make a judgment. You have this, on one hand, there's value in the data, and the other hand, perhaps there's a security concern. The process will, unearth those concerns, and then ultimately there has to be an evaluation by EIA and Office of Management and Budget to decide what to do.
One other question, and I come to you. One other question has been on harmonization. That because we have so many different member states and different institutions, harmonization is a big issue, because as always with standards, you like to stick to your existing standards and want the others to change. Is that something that you encounter, and maybe you can also say something on whether there are any good ideas on allowing for more harmonization on the European data level? So is there any good ideas are taken?
This is not as much of an issue, I think, for EIA, because the way that the data collection works, it's really done at the federal level directly to the survey respondents. So the European situation is more analogous to if we had to go through the states and the states provided the data in different formats. Because EIA is able to go directly to the potential respondents, we can set what those units are, and then of course, there's consistency in those units across surveys. So it's, I would say, less of an issue in the US because of the way that the system is structured.
I would only add that there are lots of good best practice guidelines out there for these harmonization issues, both for data, what kind of formats it should be, what units, and also providing metadata and making sure that it follows these FAIR principles and that it's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Like, there's a lot of good practice out there, so there's no need to reinvent the wheel here, I would say.
Just a spontaneous question or follow-up from me. So, I mean, Ben mentioned that we have these three different data potentially for natural gas imports, and all of them might be right, but for this thing that they are measuring, and then in the end, one of them is kind of going to be the reference that is being put on the website and being discussed. I'm just curious, or trying to think myself on what would be a good way to allow maybe everybody to provide his data, but then there is some harmonized form that is published, and all the others are still maybe accessible.
Yeah, I guess that could work, and I guess you must have these sort of stakeholder groups whenever you have like more complicated issues where you get everyone around the table to discuss the best way to deal with it, because you won't always have the expertise in-house, right? So there must be some processes there in the EIA. Yeah,
there are stakeholder meetings to help think through issues and also on harmonization. As I was talking, I was thinking there are harmonization issues with other federal agencies. So, for example, EIA was actually directed to harmonize some of our emissions estimates with EPA. There was some concern, how are you coming up with different emissions estimates? And of course, it's quite detailed, and so we had folks from EIA sit down with, their counterparts at EPA and really sort through all the assumptions and the details to help harmonize those those emissions assumptions. So we do some of that work.
Yeah, so for some of the data sets, we also just list the multiple data points and where they come from, and then maybe some indication of prioritization for the quality. And I think this management of quality is an important part, that you have sort of green-lighted data that is well-known and validated and well understood, and then maybe amber data that's been collected recently and maybe not checked. Do you have this sort of traffic light system for the data with like different sources there as well? That's an important part of the good data collection.
Nico.
Nicholas Kromeyer for Euractiv. I've been wondering this entire time, is there, in the history of the EIA, was there a sort of a big bang, or was it more like a competence creep? Because today ACER is also releasing its REMIT report, which I would assume would fulfill sort of this sub-goal of harmonized REMIT data. Is this a live competence creep that we're seeing on behalf of ACER, that with every new law that gets reformed, with people like you in the mix, that we see ACER amass more and more competences? Or do you think this has to really be something that ultimately is decided by higher level sort of authorities, maybe a political, maybe an OICO conclusion or something? I don't know.
That's a tough one to answer. I mean, I think the way that it worked in EIA's case was that the rules of the road, the enabling legislation, I think was well designed to empower staff to do the work. And then I think over time they built up significant capability to do, the survey work and the modeling. I mean, there's definitely, as with, every agency, right, there are challenges. I mean, right now you might have seen news articles where they're in a politically a tough, nothing specific about EIA, but just across the US federal government, it's a very difficult situation right now. But there's a very strong culture at EIA regarding how you go about the data collection, the processing of the data, the modeling work, that I think helps to keep that consistency in place. And hopefully that continues.
I mean, maybe one sort on the question of institutional setup and to which degree and more evolutionary process coming out of an existing institutions. Also some questions here online on that. I mean, kind of we're natural scientists plus economists, so it's not really, it's a bit hard to answer this institutional questions. My take is that ACER is making a lot of effort to get kind of more access to mandates that pertain to making energy data available, and I mean they have now these reports on the wholesale market and of gas and electricity that kind of start to look more and more like what the IEA is used to be doing. But I'm wondering whether there is not an institutional limit to what they are able to do, what they are resourced to do, and also what in changing political climates then they are allowed to continue to do. I don't know. I mean, with the REMIT database, they in principle have a huge trove of primary data that nobody else has access to, and that they could certainly build something or are already building interesting things on. But I'm not so sure whether on oil trade in Europe or demand side issues they would be find it easy to get a mandate, if not their kind of broader mandate is widened to that. And there was one other question here, kind of what institutional setups are possible, and I mean we are at that stage agnostic. I think Ben and I and Simona. I mean there is of course the JRC that has some elements of working with energy data in Europe. There is Eurostat that can of course always improve, and there is DG ENER itself that can play such a role. There's ACER, so there are multiple institutions that fulfill such functions. The question is a bit would it make sense to pool it together in some reference frame, or is there a way to coordinate them more? That, I mean, I think ideas that have been circulated is to have a website in which at least everybody brings their data, and then there's a more soft form of coordination, so that the initial data provisioning is coming still through the mandated forms. What I found interesting from the work that mainly Ben did on the databases was that we already have a huge amount of reporting obligations there. So it's not that we are essentially calling for a kind of a bureaucratic new monster that does additionally a lot of data collection, but it's more also a simplification exercise rather than one that makes things more complicated. There have been 2 questions there. Maybe we can take them quickly and then.
Hello, thank you. I'm Abhi. I work as senior analyst at Euroelectric. So I can completely feel the discussion because I also work in the same sphere. For example, in Euroelectric, we made a tool called ELDA, which is basically taking the data from the ENSO transparency platform and making it a bit more easily accessible to the public. And I also have the pain of, sometimes some countries, for example, Italian data and electricity data, if you see like last 4 or 5 months, it's not really updated. So I'm also feeling that pain, to kind of follow up on the transparency platform to correct this data. So I really feel, and again, Tom, thanks to the open source models like PIPESA, we are also trying to implement it at Euroelectric. So I can feel the discussion, but maybe some questions. Like when you say like we want like a centralized body for this, a new centralized body to kind of collect all the primary data, why you are not thinking about extending this to Eurostat? For example, Eurostat is already kind of collecting a lot of primary data. And I understand the like model how EIA is working, which is kind of directly collecting data from companies, but since EU is a bit different, like we have different languages, so I think it would be making more sense to like kind of extend this to Eurostat. Maybe I would like to know your thoughts why you are not thinking in that directions. And second, maybe a curiosity questions, why we don't have institutions here in this discussion. And third one, coming to the open source model, it would be to Tom. So it's a wonderful idea, like to have like open source model so that users can kind of assess or validate the numbers behind it. But then how do you ensure, like the numbers are accurate, like, because many people are contributing to the data. So at present, how you're ensuring the open source data is quite good. So thank you.
Yeah, maybe I start. If sorry, I'm kind of mixing my roles as moderator and speaker. So, on the institutions questions, yes, you might have seen that in between we had an institutional representation that unfortunately couldn't make it. Our understanding from discussions that we are having is that there is some momentum in that direction, coming both more top-down and more bottom-up. I mean, in the Draghi report, it has been made strong calls for also more making more data available, and I think that is heard also in the higher echelons. And then there's also, of course, my understanding is that there's also some bottom-up understanding in the institutions that some of the tasks that they are supposed to perform were hard to perform because of a lack of data. So I think there are things like the Better Data Initiative by DG ENER and that are pulling in that direction. But I agree. I mean, would have been the right setting to have someone from the institutions here. On the Eurostat question, it's also a pertinent one. My feeling was, and I might be completely wrong, and probably we should reach out more to them ourselves to understand better, that there has been not so much interest in what users essentially want in terms of energy data, so that they are kind of with this very big mandate that they have, but that is legislated, that they are maybe not the nimble institution to kind of proactively develop something that is ready for the energy transition. But that probably we should rather cross-check this prior before kind of discarding this idea. And I think I mentioned them as one of the options for such an agency.
I would also add, from what I understood about Eurostat as well, they aren't able to correct the data or backfill the data or interpolate data. It has to be what the member states give them, and any kind of energy modeling exercise needs to do those things. It needs to make estimates of what share of the electricity is going to heat pumps and so on, like these subdivision things that you see very nicely in the JRC Ideas database, where they have these models to break down the data even further. I think that would be hard for Eurostat to do with its current mandate. The data validation question is obviously always a continuing one. So we validate, there's different levels of it as well. So there's been comparisons done between Pipester and Plexos, because Plexos is the standard tool often used for these analysis. It's a commercial tool owned by companies in the US. So there's a model validation part to make sure the math is all fitting. And there's a constant data side, so we can do checks on the data, the aggregated data. Do we have the right number of kilometers of transmission lines, and are we meeting the energy balances? But then we also do checks on more detailed things, like how much redispatch is there in Germany in 2019 for the congestion management, or how much curtailment are we seeing in the model? How well do we match the prices, and how well do we match the dispatch, and so on? And there's quite a lot of detailed checks when you're running an hourly model that you can do to keep checking on the data. And I'm not saying it's perfect or anything, but my vision would be that you at some point have a whole series of different models for different years that are agreeing maybe 20% on the prices in most hours, and that people can take as a relatively reliable then benchmark for how the system is operating. And it's hard. I mean, it's hard, and there's not always incentives to do the validation. As academics, we get incentives to write flashy, sexy papers, but there's not that much incentives in the system for validation. And I think it'd be very good for an institutional setting to have the resources to do that validation so people gain trust in the models.
And I take one last question from me, lady, and then we close up.
Katarina Maskant from Teneo, Senior Advisor on Sustainability. I was waiting and waiting for someone here to mention the data spaces. What happened with the energy data space? Is it up and running? What did they collect? Is it not good enough? Is that an idea that you could take further? Because there was a lot of discussions a while back, but I know it was delays and all of that. So just as a very basic question. And then maybe secondly, from an American point of view, one very concrete hands-on question is, how often do you update the data? Because of course that will then depend on how you can use it and who can use it. And maybe also secondly, do you know who used your data? Who were the big users of your data? What did they do with it? Any unexpected usage of your data, etc.? So if you could share a little bit around that as well. Thank you.
Can I push back the question on the energy data spaces to you, because we are actually ignorant of that. That is, so it might be quite useful if you can say a few words on that.
It is there.
Hmm?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was more there at the very early stage when we talked about the digitalization of the energy systems, because Vestager asked us to come with some thoughts. So I was very much involved in the beginning, but it's there, I think, right? So it's something there, I don't know, but we discussed all the things we discussed here about data quality, comparability, ownership, cybersecurity, and all of that, but I actually then didn't follow up what actually happened with this data space. But it should be there somewhere.
Anybody from the institutions that has doesn't know? Okay. Yeah, no, interesting.
Okay, so on the how often is the data updated? It just depends on on the data collection side. It really depends on the survey that we're talking about. Some are updated more frequently than others. Some data is collected, on a weekly basis, a monthly basis. The large consumption surveys are often done. It's a several-year cycle. So it really does depend on the data set. On the modeling side, the short-term energy outlook is updated. The input assumptions are updated every month before it's released. And then for the long-term modeling work, the annual and international energy outlook, the model input data is updated on an annual basis. In terms of who uses the data, again, I think that it's very specific to the product. I would say that we have a very wide array of stakeholders that are very interested in our data. Everyone from academic groups that are using it to do research and analysis to businesses to analysts and other analysts in the federal government. So we tried to cater to a very broad range of stakeholders. And product by product, the teams at EIA know who some of the key stakeholders are. So when there's discussion of updating a particular product, they'll often have stakeholder meetings to bring those folks in and give them an opportunity to voice their opinion.
Good. With that, I would suggest we close up here, then maybe we can have a few more bilateral chats after that. There are many more interesting questions on Slido, but I think it would be good to wrap it up now. My main takeaway also for the next steps is that there's essentially two challenges ahead. One is the more technical challenges on kind of setting up the rules of the game, deciding on harmonization, licensing. So a lot of things that statistical agencies and statistical experts are needed, and the users are needed in this debate. But they only will join such a discussion and invest into that if there is the political ground provided that something goes ahead. And that's the other big thing that I believe we need to continue to push for. That I hope this event helped to kind of bring across the message that there is an issue and that there are solutions for this issue in principle available that require some political momentum. We believe that in this town there is some significant interest in that, but to be quite honest, from my perspective, it's not so easy to see how to crystallize that into institutional momentum, and we very much hope that this can be picked up. At Bruegel, we I think in 2022 already did some Nature article on the need for a forum of energy agency, and I think the work by Tom and others on open modeling and open data has contributed massively. So I think the time is ripe, and we hope that this moves ahead, and we hope that the next time we have this discussion, also the institutions will take part to help us to understand what the political constraints are and how to overcome them. Thanks a lot for spending 1.5 hours with us. Hope you also learned something and enjoyed the debate as much as I did. And looking forward to see you soon at Bruegel. Thank you.